We will now turn to Korea, particularly Chosun Korea. Just remember how we've been talking about Ming China and Qing China. Chosun is the term we use to refer to the dynasty that ruled Korea, ruling family from between 1392 to 1910. And you can see that this dynasty lasted a super long time, right? They're going to last over 500 years, which is pretty impressive. And what makes Korea, I think, particularly impressive is the fact that it exists at all, right? Korea is surrounded by two much larger countries. To the west is, of course, China, which was an expansive country. Remember, the Qing went out in particular and conquered a large amount of territory, but Korea was able to maintain its independence. And to the east, of course, is Japan, which, while not as large comparatively as China is to Korea, it's still bigger than Korea. So Korea, the fact that they're able to keep their independence and to maintain their own culture is itself pretty impressive, and that their dynasty is able to last this long, it's also very impressive. And I should point out that I am a specialist in Korea. When I publish articles as part of my research, they're usually on Korea, particularly Chosun Korea. Now, Korea had long accepted Chinese Confucian culture. Koreans had accepted Chinese writing, they accepted Confucian morality, and they had even adapted, though they did change it a bit, the Chinese exam system. So Korea, unlike some other countries, was not considered barbarians by the Chinese. The Chinese understood that they were different. They understood that they were an independent country, but they did not see the Koreans as barbarians because the Koreans had accepted, as I said, Chinese Confucian culture. The Korean kingdom also accepted the Chinese emperor as his older brother. Notice king and emperor. The Koreans during this time period are not going to claim to be emperors. They claim to be kings. And they recognize the Chinese emperor not as their equal, that would be impossible, but as their older brother. And they offered the Chinese emperor tribute, showing that they had accepted their place as an inferior country to China, right? China is the center of the universe. It's the middle kingdom. Only it has an emperor, but the Koreans have accepted the Chinese emperor as their overlord and offered tribute. Now, this turns out to be a really good deal for the Koreans. You may ask, well, why would you do this? Well, the answer is fairly simple. First of all, it provides Korea with security. You can't really justify invading your younger brother, right? And Confucians thought in these terms of older brother, younger brother, and so forth. The job of the younger brother is to obey the older brother, but the older brother has to treat the younger brother with benevolence. And it would not be very benevolent to invade a fellow Confucian country. So for the most part, Korea's acceptance of Chinese civilization, of Chinese culture, will allow it to maintain its own security, to stay independent. And of course, it can also then get access to Chinese culture, its advanced civilization, as well as trade with China. And one thing we have to stress is, even though Korea accepted China as its overlord, it was still an independent country. Korea had its own army, it had its own diplomats, and there were absolutely no Qing officials stationed in Korea. Right? So Koreans, by accepting this kind of inferior position as the younger brother, were able to maintain their security while still gaining access to advanced Chinese culture and civilization. Right? So in a sense, they're able to get the best of both worlds. Now, how then did the kings of Korea justify ruling an independent country? Right? The Korean kings claimed that they were there ruling for the good of the common people. That as the kings of Korea, they ruled for the good of the common Korean people. Right? As kings, they should be benevolent. But someone could reasonably just say, well, why not just be a part of China? Why not just be ruled directly by the Son of Heaven? And the Koreans would argue, if you were to pose this question to them during this time period, that because their customs were different from Chinese customs, because they were a different people, they had to shape Confucian civilization to Korea themselves. Right? So while they borrowed from China, in terms of its culture and civilization, they did it at the same time while adapting it to Korea itself, right? So Koreans would argue that yes, we're Confucian, our king rules with benevolence for our good, but we shouldn't be a part of China because our customs are different from the Chinese, and so we have to shape Confucianism to suit ourselves. And you can really see this kind of, the two sides of this coin, I think, through this man, King Sejong the Great. He's the only Korean king who has the epithet the Great, and he was really an amazing guy. He really was a good king who cared deeply about his people. And he has a reputation as a very benevolent king, as the most Confucian of kings, right? He really took seriously his role as a king, meaning that he had to care about his people. And what's interesting is he took this kind of Confucian concept of benevolence and caring about his people and applied it to assert Korean culture by developing Hangeul. Remember, Koreans used Chinese to write. Koreans had borrowed Chinese writing. The problem is that's really difficult to speak one language and write in a different language. So imagine that you speak English, but you have to write in French. That's kind of what the Koreans have been doing, right? They spoke one language, but they wrote a different language, right? They spoke Korean, but they wrote Chinese. And King Sejong, he said, this is fine for people who are educated because we have time to learn how to do this. But what about average everyday people? They don't have time to do this, right? They don't have the ability to do this. So he is going to order the development of Hangeul, right? An alphabet for Koreans, right? This is the only time in human history we know of where you actually had a government sit down and say, okay, we're going to develop our own alphabet. Now, so this kind of, I think it's fascinating, right? Sejong, out of a benevolent Confucian concern for his people, wanted to make it easier for them to write. So he helped develop, he ordered the development of an alphabet that allowed them to assert their own identity, their own culture that differentiated them from China. But one of the key things was that after developing this new alphabet, he ordered books on Confucianism being written using it, right? So he fuses together this kind of idea of Korean identity as being different from Chinese while still being a part of this kind of greater Confucian civilization. And in Korea today, and I have visited this place, there is in fact a whole museum dedicated to the alphabet. That's how proud Koreans are of this alphabet and of their King Sejong the Great, that they actually spent a lot of money building a really, really nice museum in honor of their alphabet, which I think is fascinating. They even have a Hangeul Day. They even have a day celebrating their alphabet. So you can see the strong connection between Korean identity and this alphabet. Now, even though the Koreans were very good at diplomacy and at maintaining their independence and stability, and you saw how long the Joseon dynasty lasted, you can see that, they are going to face difficulties. And this is going to tell us something about, again, the power of East Asia, but also why they're going to stop developing science and technology. So we're going to get to Japan shortly, but in the late 16th century, much of Japan was united under a man named Toyotomi Hideyoshi. And Hideyoshi was not interested in just being uniting Japan. He wanted to unite all of East Asia. And he told the Koreans, he said, I'm going to invade China, and I would like to do it through your country. So if you would please stand aside and let me move my troops to your country, I would appreciate it. And the Koreans said, well, no, China's our older brother. That's where the emperor is. We're not going to just stand aside and let you do this. So what will happen then is Japan under Toyotomi Hideyoshi will actually invade Korea to try and get at China. And a joint Korean-Chinese army, as well as navy, which is primarily Korean, will actually defeat Japan and will force Hideyoshi to withdraw his forces. Now, you can see how high-tech the Koreans were. If you look at that ship on the right, that is called a gobuksun, or turtle ship. And it's kind of an early ironclad. It's not completely covered in metal, but they did have these metal roof with spikes on the top in order to protect themselves from Japanese who might try and board the ship. But this ship was outfitted with very powerful cannon. The dragon head on the front was not there simply for show. They actually could pump poison gas or a smoke screen out of that dragon's head. And they also had, I believe, a cannon they could move up and fire through it as well. So my point here is that in this war, you had the development of new kinds of technology that were very effective, like these turtle ships. And these played a key role in cutting off the Japanese supply lines and defeating the Japanese army in Korea. And one thing we want to stress is that one thing that made the Westerners so powerful that they're able to come in and dominate East Asia in the 19th century is because of their advanced military technology. Now, we may ask ourselves, why stop developing military technology, right? The East Asian people, as you can see in this Korean turtle ship, were quite capable of developing advanced military technology. So what happened? Well, they stopped having wars, right? From the time period of the Qing conquest of China in 1644 until the coming of the Europeans, there was no major war between China, Japan, and Korea for several hundred years. So they stopped developing military technology because they were at peace. So again, just like we saw earlier, China had access to Western science. China had the ability, if it wanted to go out and explore, but didn't for reasons that are rational, right? They had good reasons for not wanting to continue to explore. And here you can see Koreans, and they kind of represent all East Asians, all were capable of developing advanced technology had they chosen to, were able to develop this technology. But because after the Qing conquest of China, there weren't any major wars in East Asia, they stopped developing this technology. And it's kind of ironic. We want peace. People don't want to generally live through lots and lots of constant fighting. But because East Asia actually accomplished peace, they stopped developing advanced military technology. In contrast, Europeans will keep fighting each other. They won't have peace. And because of that, they become really, really good at fighting, get really, really good technology. And so in the 19th century, when they come to East Asia, they're able to, in a sense, bully East Asian people relatively easily, right? Because they don't need to develop this technology because they're living in peace.